That ends portfolio questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion 4787 in the name of Liz Smith on education. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak button now. Can I remind all members at the outset that time is extremely tight today, so we are going to hold you to your time. Regrettably, some members who wish to take part in the debate are unable to do so, so I would ask for cooperation of all members. I call on Liz Smith to speak to move the motion. Ms Smith, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, last Friday there were several members in this chamber who were privileged to attend the SCDI Awards dinner at the magnificent new Emirates in Glasgow, at which Dr Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State in the US, was the guest speaker. It was a remarkable speech from a remarkable woman. Asked to set out the challenges ahead and how she thought Scottish businesses and industry should respond, she said that she thought understanding globalisation was the key, and no more so than in the sphere of education. We had, she said, to question what we were training our young people for and why. Her words, Presiding Officer, provide a convenient backdrop to the debate this afternoon on widening access in our colleges and why on this side of the chamber it is our contention that that overall ambition is being seriously compromised by the misplaced focus of Scottish Government policy. The debate, which I hope will soon be followed by another debate about widening access in universities, will examine the crucial role which our colleges can play in a fast-changing global economy to help Scotland stay ahead of the game in the manner suggested by Dr Albright, and notwithstanding the acceptance of the very tight financial constraints affecting many economies, we want to urge the Scottish Government to refocus its budget priorities and tackle head-on the criticism which has been levied at the Government from so many sources in education, business and industry. Specifically, taking up the comment from Jeremy Peake for the David Hume Institute, there is a need to ensure that change is not at the cost of the crucial role which colleges play in providing opportunities for the many diverse parts of society. In this chamber and in several portfolio and cross-party committees, we have been reminded many times by experts in the sector that further education reaches part of the population that other educational institutions don't, and that it has an increasing reputation for inspiring these groups towards more meaningful employment, including greater interest in successful entrepreneurial activity. The role of our colleges is, I think, very clear, and so too is the Scottish Conservatives' respect for all the staff and students involved. Firstly, in educational terms, it is clear that they want to move away from an outdated system where institutions matter more than people, away from being the institutions which the public often labelled very simplistically as being in between school and in between school and university. Instead, they want to ensure that the provision of their education is responsive to the needs of their local economy, as well, of course, to the national economy, which incidentally they have done to a tune of 1% of GDP over 8 years. They want better articulation, which is a point which will be developed by my colleague Mary Scanlon, and they want to provide greater flexibility so that college education really is open to a wider cross-section of society. And it's on this point that I want to dwell, because in my book, it is this greater flexibility which matters so much to the modern economy and which provides colleges with their important social function to widen access and reduce inequalities. Colleges have come a very long way in recent years to make themselves more responsive to the needs of a much more diverse working population, to those of mature students, part-time students, disabled students, to the needs of women students with families, to younger students from groups for whom in days past a college education would only have been a pipe dream, and to the ethnic minority groups who at one time got completely left behind. We must not forget the fact that from 300,000 or so total learners at college, around 75,000 of these are full-time, which clearly means that the majority are part-time. 54% of college students are women, when the comparable figure is 49% in secondary school. Only 38% of college students are in the 16 to 24-year age group, which many people tend to think of the traditional student age, and 25% come from the more deprived communities. To quote John Henderson, Chief Executive of Scotland's Colleges, "The enormous strength of our college system is its ability to cater for a diverse range of students at different times in their lives." And he went on to say that the policy should reflect that, and that the allocation of Scottish Funding Council money must ensure that no one group is disadvantaged when it comes to aspiring to a college education. And he pointed out that per-head spending is traditionally lower than it is in HE and in secondary schooling, and that the college sector, which derives a much greater percentage of its funding from the public purse, is obviously more susceptible to budget cuts. Now, as this chamber knows, the Cabinet Secretary has announced that he is keen on college audits. So let me assist him. Firstly, and notwithstanding the fact that there are many people, including many members of the Education Committee and their recent witnesses at committee, who have found it exceedingly difficult to pick our way through the unintelligibility of some of the data that has been presented to us as we scrutinise the current budget, there is the issue of the overall college budget spend. We acknowledge that there are cuts to the overall Scottish budget, and that, by definition, the Scottish Government is in a position where it must make cuts. We accept that, and we also acknowledge that some of these decisions are difficult. But let us be very clear. The decisions about where priority spending should be within Scottish education is entirely a matter for the Scottish Government. And I believe the college sector, many businesses across Scotland and the opposition parties in this Parliament have all combined to send a very strong message to the Scottish Government that it is unacceptable that our colleges have been the target of such significant cuts, cuts which, as the Labour Party amendment rightly points out, mean that the college funding over the next 3 years is to be reduced by a quarter, something that was central to the Audit Scotland report and its concerns that such cuts present to this college as a sector in its entirety. But most importantly, there has been a disproportionate cut to teaching budgets, the very budgets which the college sector tells us makes the greatest difference to the quality of what is on offer within the coursework of our colleges. And so this means, despite the £24 million of transfer from the Employability Fund to colleges, and we obviously wait to hear what the detail of that is, there will be a 15.8% cut to teaching budgets in academic year 2012-13 compared to 2010-11, cuts which mean £73 million will be lost. We know that since 2009-10, 2,300 jobs have been lost in the sector. We know that some college courses have been cut, some have disappeared altogether, and we are being told by many students and by staff that class sizes are likely to grow in order to cope. Not the best advert for a sector that has worked so hard to improve standards and which is striving to become more flexible, not less. And it is not surprising that they now have a major bone of contention with the Scottish Government because they do not believe that it is any of their fault. Secondly, on the question of female participation, we know that the number of female learners has declined by just over 26% since academic year 2006-07. And while some of that can be explained by demographic changes, it is by no means the whole story. Worse still, when it compares with what has happened to male student numbers, it is twice the rate of decline. And of course, much of the reason for this is the fact that the Scottish Government has chosen to prioritise full-time courses for younger students because of the youth unemployment situation. Indeed, the First Minister said in this chamber last week that that was the priority because it is full-time places which are more likely to lead to jobs. Perhaps not the best message the First Minister has ever sent out. We know that women students are much more likely to want to take up evening or weekend courses, courses which are structured to suit the changing demands of women and their families, and which are the very kind of courses which were designed to encourage more women to take up college places so that they could enter the labour market. And it is at this point that I also want to mention the issue related to mobility. One of the huge advantages of colleges has been their local dimension, and their ability to provide for those who do not have the resources to travel longer distances. And that is particularly true for women who have busy lives with their families, and how sad it would be if we saw a reversal of the good work in that area. Now, so far, the Scottish Government has not come back with many public rebuttals about that, except to say that they have laid on more childcare facilities. They have. But that is not going to be much good if the college places are not there in the first place. And what do we make of the situation for those students for whom college education was previously only a pipe dream, and who are clearly a large part of the 16 to 19 initiative, which the Scottish Government claims is a priority, of the excellent work that colleges like John Wheatley have been doing for this category of student? These are the very students who need greater support, both in terms of one-to-one or smaller group attention or help with their coursework, because they are often less able to do that on their own. It is my firm understanding that one of the key rationales behind regionalisation was to ensure that there was greater scope for flexibility, to ensure diverse needs would be catered for. And I've heard the Cabinet Secretary say several times now that he wants college reform to remove what he describes as the dreadful Thatcherite structures which led to far too much autonomy and overlap of course provision. Well, if his plans to withdraw more autonomy mean that too many courses are actually shut down, then it is little wonder that it is the Cabinet Secretary who is now on the receiving end of the sharpest criticism. Because week by week, we are getting evidence that there are problems, like Carnegie College, where 3 courses, one at HND level, has gone, or Inverness College, where there aren't now enough supervisors to cope with some technical course provision. So how on earth can the Scottish Government argue that their policies are widening access when this is happening? I don't understand what the Government's reason for this approach is, and I would suggest neither do the colleges, who time after time have been warning the Scottish Government of the folly of their position. And in this note, Presiding Officer, over the last 24 hours, we have seen extraordinarily heated exchanges between a college chair, now resigned, and the Cabinet Secretary. None of us in this chamber, except the Cabinet Secretary himself, is in a position to know what the full facts about the management of this meeting were, and perhaps even more importantly about what communications have taken place. But given the claims and counterclaims which now exist, and which I suggest have been around for some time within the sector, that there are allegations of cultural bullying from the Cabinet Secretary, I would suggest, Presiding Officer, that there is now a case to answer, and that the Cabinet Secretary is called before the Education Committee. I heard the convener of the committee this morning say that he does not believe there is any need for this. I think there are many in this chamber who beg to differ. And if I may say so, I do not consider it appropriate for the convener of any parliamentary committee, who may after all have to act as the arbiter on this matter, to be judge and jury at the same time. Any convener's first responsibility is to his or her committee, and this is even more important when there is majority government. Presiding Officer, as far as I'm concerned, the facts speak for themselves. There are plenty of facts, and I've given you quite a lot of them. Presiding Officer, this is a very serious matter. I would suggest all the opposition parties recognise that. Many parts of Scotland recognise that, and above all, the college sector is crying out for help because there are misplaced priorities. This Government has to recognise it, and I have pleasure in moving the motion in my name.
I now call on Michael Russell to speak to and move amendment number 4787.2. Cabinet Secretary, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I say, and apart from the last minute of the speech by Liz Smith, I commend her for bringing this motion to the Chamber. I think the measured tone in which she addressed the issue was entirely appropriate. I have profound differences with her on this issue, and I'm going to outline those, and I'm going to outline the strong reasons why we needed reform in this sector, and the strong reasons why that reform is and will produce the results that we need. Now, I regret in the last minute she lapsed into the negativity that she did. I expect a great deal of negativity from the Labour benches today. Indeed, I woke up, presiding officer, this morning to the radio to hear some extraordinary negativity and to read it in the newspapers. An astonishing accusation that was made. I don't know if members know this, but according to Claire Baker, there's a Scottish Government minister who's responsible for the ash dieback disease. I've looked this up and I discover it's actually caused by fungus on fruity bodies, infected trees die, it's spread on clothing, footwear of vehicles from Europe. But according to Labour, it's the SNP's fault. Let us focus on the realities of college funding and delivery, and in those circumstances we might make progress, because there is a debate to be had. I believe that the college sector should deliver for Scotland. And the college sector that we inherited did not deliver for Scotland. It failed 5 groups of people, and it's very important to recognise this. First of all, it failed employers, because the outcomes of the courses were not focused on employment. There were, bluntly, too many hobby courses and far too few courses focused on employment. It failed those who worked in the college sector, because the balkanisation of the sector with 42 different sets of terms and conditions allowed division. It requires a single set of terms and conditions. It failed local authorities who wanted to join up with the college sector and were not allowed to do so, indeed in some ways not allowed to do so by a statute that was put in place in 1992. It failed communities, because many of the boards of the colleges were self-perpetuating. There was no fresh blood in them, and those boards were not reflective of the wider communities. And most importantly of all, it failed students. It wasn't meeting the objectives that students had. It wasn't providing the learner journey that they needed. It wasn't producing clear progression routes. It wasn't producing better links to schools, universities and employers. What we needed was a reform that produced colleges of scale and efficiency, focusing on the needs of the economy. That is what I said a year ago when I introduced this process of reform. That is what we are focused on now. And I have to say that is what we have had the overwhelming support for in the college sector. And I find it a surprising argument from a Conservative to say that we should have continued with a sector that was duplicating, and there was clear evidence of duplication and clear evidence of inefficiency and waste, yet we should continue with it, because that is the argument that I've heard, and it's an utterly wrong argument. Now, I want to make progress, Mr Finlay, please. Now, this is a sector that could perform better and will perform better. It's a sector that we can have with confident learners leaving college with the right qualifications. We need and have had already a 9% increase in full-time learners at advanced level. We have already more intensive full-time courses delivering high-level skills. Completion rates are now rising, and they were unacceptably high because we've undertaken these reforms. And we are in the process of creating one of the most responsive college sectors in the world. Scotland is a hotbed, one moment please, Scotland is a hotbed of potential and talent. The changes will allow that talent to thrive. Now, I accept that access is of key importance. I welcome scrutiny on access. Colleges are open to all, regardless of background, as indeed is the whole of Scottish education, though proposals from the Tories and indeed from Labour would stop that happening, as we know from evidence south of the border. We have kept student support budget at a record £95.6 million for the second year running. I give way to Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
Talks about widening access. Could I ask him about adult learners with learning difficulties? What is the situation there for those people trying to access college? How many courses have gone?
I have made it clear in my discussions with the sector, as has the SFC, that we want to make sure that the retention of the widest range of students takes place, and the outcome agreements can take care of that, and I'll come on to it in a moment. But we've kept student support budget at record level, and unfortunately access is something that has been subjected to some meaningless statements and baseless assertions. It is a false message to young people to say there's no room for them in Scottish education, but that is the message that is going out from some people in this chamber, and I'll tell you why, presiding officer. Let's start on headcount. We have to understand that headcount is a volatile statistic. It is a very poor measure. It fluctuates, depending not on funding, but on the way colleges spread teaching activity because of their local focus. The most accurate measure is, and always has been, full-time equivalent student numbers, and unlike universities or schools, and around 3/4 of college students until recently were part-time. So full-time equivalent, and expressed in that way, we've maintained student numbers, we've also maintained the volume of teaching. But that fixation on headcount has another problem, because it actually says that its quality is not of relevance. Job prospects and key employment skills are not the priority. It's just keeping numbers high. It's a never mind the quality, feel the width approach. My opponents appear unconcerned with the type of head that's counted. They put together an intensive full-time engineering course. That's one head. A short recreational course. That's another head. The value of a college cannot be determined by the speed at which you wheel large numbers in and large numbers out. We have to end that merry-go-round, and that is what employers and others told me. And that's what we're trying to do. I give way to Liz Smith.
Liz Smith.
I don't in any way dispute the complexity of much of the analysis when it comes to college spend. Would you acknowledge, however, that it has been seriously compromised this year, and that something has been reflected in the witnesses that have come to committee, because there is no consistency of how we measure these figures?
To accept that, and I said to you at the committee when you asked me that question, I think the figures are quite clear as to where we are. It is quite clear from the baseline figures where we are. It is quite clear the additional money that we have added in on every single year. We are going through a complex process of change, but we are focused on getting the maximum value for public money. I would have thought that across this chamber we would have had support for that activity. Now, it is quite clear also that you can't base this argument, of course.
Mary Scanlon.
Listening to Neil Findlay and indeed the Conservatives, but the Auditor General in her report from last month says the expected benefits and costs of the government's reform are unclear. You've not published a quantified assessment of costs, of reforms or the expected benefits. So if the Auditor General doesn't know, if it's not being published, how do you expect us to know?
I'm very fond of Mary Scanlon, but she really should have been at the meeting at which that was discussed, because it was quite clear that we were taking forward, as the sector is taking forward, the answers to those very questions, because there are real answers to those questions. They come in the outcome agreement, and if Mary Scanlon would like to meet with me to discuss the college sector, I'd be delighted to have that discussion with her. So we can't have a focus on facts that aren't true. We can't have a focus on what are misleading statistics, but we can have a focus on what colleges are doing. And that's why the outcome agreements are so important. We're not only putting in place a reform sector, we're putting in place a very clear understanding of what that sector does, a sector that delivers for the whole of Scotland. And the message to young people is that the opportunity is there for them. Young people have many opportunities, and they're in the Opportunities for All scheme. And I want to conclude on that, because that is so significant. This debate is being handled as if colleges were the only thing that took place for young people across Scotland. That is another fallacy that's being peddled. This government, and I'm very proud of this fact, this government has put in place the Opportunities for All scheme, which says that every young person will have either a job or a place in education or a place in training. And that gives the lie to almost everything that we are going to hear this afternoon from opposition parties. Because there is an opportunity for every single young person. That has never been guaranteed in Scotland before. During the worst economic crisis in living memory, during the cuts that were started by Labour and have been progressed by Liberals and the Tories, we've made that offer, an opportunity for every single young person. And we're delivering it in a variety of ways through Skills Development Scotland and through the colleges and through a reformed college sector. Because it's that reformed college sector that's going to deliver for the future of Scotland. That is absolutely essential. I had hoped in the process of the last year that people would have read the documentation, looked at what's taking place, seen the enthusiasm in the sector for constructive change, and gone with that change. Regrettably, unfortunately, all the opposition parties can do is resist change. That's true conservatism. True conservatism from the Conservatives, true conservatism as ever from Labour in Scotland. The reality is we are delivering the change that is needed in Scotland. I do hope that this chamber might one day wake up and back that.
Thank you. I'm not certain if you moved your amendment or not, Cabinet Secretary.
I think I will move the amendment. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much. I now call on Hugh Henry to speak to and move Amendment 4787.1. Mr Henry, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. It's just not true that people in this chamber are opposed to change, and indeed Scottish Labour does welcome some of the changes being discussed for Scotland's colleges. There is undoubtedly an argument for making sure that Scotland's colleges are fit for the challenges of the 21st century. But the issue is how you bring about change, whether you dictate and impose or whether you discuss and move forward together. And what we have seen from this Cabinet Secretary and this government is dictation and dictatorship and imposition and a failure to discuss and to take people with them. Now, you can sit and catcall and name-call, but you can't deny... Excuse me, Presiding Officer, I said nothing during the Cabinet Secretary's contribution. Others may have done so, but if they want to shout and bawl, then fine, because they know that this Cabinet Secretary is on dodgy ground. The fact is that Scotland's colleges can and should improve. There is no doubt about it. But really, it's wrong to suggest that everything that went before has been a failure, as he seemed to indicate. There are many thousands of people across Scotland who have benefited from the excellence delivered by Scotland's colleges, including some in this chamber whose lives have been transformed by those colleges. So it is wrong to rubbish the past simply to try and persuade for the future. And if there was a time when we needed colleges, then surely now, more than ever before, with rising unemployment, with youth unemployment nearly to 100,000 young people, where just the latest statistics show that Scottish unemployment has risen by 4,000 from the last quarter, while UK unemployment fell. That employment has fallen by 27,000 from the last quarter, while UK employment rose, and that youth unemployment has risen sharply over the last quarter, increasing by 10,000 among 16 to 24-year-olds. Now more than ever, we need Scotland's colleges for our young people, but we need Scotland's colleges for the workers facing redundancy at Halls and Broxburn, for the workers in Glasgow, for the workers in East Kilbride, for the workers across Scotland who have to retrain and rethink what their future should be. That's why we need Scotland's colleges, and that's why we need to build on the excellence that they deliver. And we know that Scotland's colleges have a fantastic record in reaching out and helping people who otherwise would be marginalised from Scottish education and indeed from Scottish life. Colleges can give people the chance that otherwise they would never, ever have. And how then can we expect our colleges to transform and to rise to these challenges when they are having to face unprecedented cuts in their budget? You know, people talk about smoke and mirrors, and people talk about lies, damned lies and statistics. And what we have heard from this Cabinet Secretary is an absolute failure to face up to the facts and to admit for once that he is wrong and Audit Scotland are right. And is he trying to suggest to this chamber that Audit Scotland, a body which has the respect of just about every section of Scottish public life, does not know what they're talking about and does not know the true facts? They have said a 24% cut over the spending review period. That is the reality. And how can the colleges cope with falling budgets, with fewer staff, with courses cut and with fewer places? We know that there are waiting lists. The Cabinet Secretary had the chance to accept that there were waiting lists at education questions in this chamber. He was asked 3 times in the same session to face up to that. And he said that the concept of waiting lists is utterly false. Scotland's colleges are completely wrong, and he yet again is completely right. The fact is that there are waiting lists. And if the concept is utterly false, why do we have an audit of something that is utterly false? You know, it's bizarre. And yet we still don't know who is carrying out that audit. What's the terms of reference? We don't know what they're doing and how they are expected to go about it. Yet again, hiding the facts and hiding the process and trying to distort and trying to confuse. We have a Cabinet Secretary whose whole premise is based on that philosophy. I don't have time to go into the details of what happened at Stowe College, but unfortunately I think it paints the Cabinet Secretary in a bad light. He has used unacceptable tactics to get his way. He has tried to intimidate when discussion would have been far, far better. And that was no private meeting. I was able to Google on the internet this afternoon and get the details of everything that the Cabinet Secretary said, everyone who spoke, and the answers to everyone who spoke. So I know exactly what went on during that meeting. That was no secret meeting, but the shame of it, whether that man was right or wrong to record it. Whether that was the case or not, it was the response from the Cabinet Secretary that was shameful, and that he abused his position and he let himself and this Parliament down by his actions.
Thank you very much. We now move to open debate, and I call on Stuart Maxwell to be followed by Neil Bibby. A very strict 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate on what is a very important subject, that of further education. And I want to start with some facts about what's happening here in Scotland. The Scottish Government is delivering the best student support package in the UK. Students in Scotland who are 18 or over can apply for a maintenance bursary of up to £89.07 a week. From next year, the Scottish Government is ensuring that the most vulnerable students will be helped by providing a minimum income of £7,250 per year in student support. The Scottish Government has also retained the educational maintenance allowance, which has been scrapped down south. And on this point, Liam Burns, the President of the NUS, said about the UK Government changes to EMA, further cutting support for the poorest college students at a time when job and study opportunities are few and far between is a massive mistake. Many in the Government claim EMA was simply an unnecessary incentive. It was nothing of the sort. Many of the poorest students rely on small regular payments to cover costs like travel, food and books that allow them to stay in education and improve their life chances. EMA represented a lifeline for the poorest students. I agree with Liam Burns. It is a valued and a valuable support mechanism, but the Tory Lib Dem coalition scrapped it, certainly.
Gavin Brown.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. The member just said he agrees with Liam Burns. What did Liam Burns have to say about the college cuts that this government are imposing?
Stuart Maxwell.
I presume that when he's asking the question, he doesn't know what Liam Burns said about the college cuts. But I will point to the fact that the committee report and the evidence we received will be a robust report on the issue, taking into account all of the evidence received by the Education Committee in a fair and balanced and robust report on the Government's budget. In 2014-15, further education spending in Scotland will be about £91 per head, compared to around £62 per head in England. This is a huge gap. Scotland will be spending about a third more than down south. John Henderson, the Chief Executive of Scotland's Colleges, indicated his support for the student support package that the Scottish Government is introducing. He said, "This is a hugely positive step from the Scottish Government. The 40,000 students studying at higher education level in colleges across Scotland will benefit greatly from this support package, and I am sure it will encourage more students from low-income backgrounds to think about signing up to a higher education course." And can I remind members of the opposition parties in this chamber that the SNP is the only major party in Scotland never to have voted for tuition fees. The Labour Party have frankly been all over the place on this issue, but I think we now have a clear position. They're telling the young people of Scotland and their families that we cannot afford free education, but we can afford to spend hundreds of millions of pounds on weapons of mass destruction. That is the Labour Party position, and that is appalling. Now, while I applaud the fact that the Tories have a stated aim of extended further education opportunities to a wider cross-section of society, it's hard to see how the introduction of tuition fees which have been imposed on students in England by the Coalition, could foster such an aim. UCAS figures show that Scotland is the only part of the UK which has seen a rise in university and college admissions, with admissions up a little bit in Scotland, but down by almost 8% in England in 1 year. Now, while this has been going on down south, this SNP government have been investing some £4.7 billion in colleges, 40% more than under the 2 terms of the previous administration, and this is in the face of swingeing cuts from Westminster. In contrast, the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition is cutting the budget for further education by £1.1 billion over the spending review period. They have scrapped the educational maintenance allowance, which I said earlier, which provides support to the poorest students. And, of course, students in England have to pay tuition fees. Now, much has been said about the £9,000 fees at some English universities, but not much has been said about the fees for college courses. So I want to put that right. So let's look at what's happening in full-time college students in England. There are 187 further education colleges with access agreements funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for England with full-time undergraduate provision. The average student fee at further education colleges south of the border in 2013-14 will be an estimated £6,429. For further education colleges with access agreements, let me finish this point and I will let you in. With access agreements, the average student fee for a full-time student in 2013-14 is estimated to be £6,995, up from £6,836 in 12-13. Figures from the Office of Fair Access show that for the academic year 2013-14, 28 further education colleges south of the border have already been given permission to charge fees of over £6,000 a year for full-time students and £4,500 per year for part-time students. How does that equate to fair access for students across the UK? In Scotland, students pay no fees. They concentrate on acquiring an education and not on acquiring debt. Liz Smith.
I thank the member for giving way. There are cuts. I said that in my speech. What is at issue here is that the priorities of the Scottish Government in Scotland, for which they are entirely responsible, are misplaced because colleges are having to bear the bigger brunt. Would the member accept that?
I wouldn't accept that. What I fail to understand is what the member would cut instead. Or is she making clear that what she would do is introduce the very tuition fees that I just mentioned to both university students and college students? If that's their position, then I'm glad that she has made that clear. The Scottish Government, Presiding Officer, recognises that people and the skills they acquire are Scotland's most valuable resource. That's why the Government has ensured that access to education is based on ability to learn, not, as is increasingly the case in England, on the ability to pay. Presiding Officer, the Tories' attack on the Scottish Government, I believe, is without credibility. And it's time the opposition parties in this chamber rallied round to help protect Scotland's young people from the onslaught of austerity coming from the UK Government.
I now call on Anne McTaggart to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Liz Smith for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and I am pleased to have the opportunity of representing the concerns of many students in Glasgow on the issues of funding and support for access to further education. For so many young people, a college education is both an opportunity to develop key life skills and a route into employment. With 1 in 4 young people out of work, it is important that we offer college courses that are relevant to the future working lives and access routes to enable those from all backgrounds to achieve their educational goals. Tragically, this Scottish Government is making it harder for young people to progress into further education by cutting college budgets and are penalising those who require more flexible part-time studies, such as mothers and young carers, by charging them to access these courses. The recent Audit Scotland report noted a 24% cut in college budgets over the spending review period, and it is simply disingenuous of the Cabinet Secretary to claim that this will result in anything but fewer places for applicants from the most disadvantaged of backgrounds. Only a few weeks ago, Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell claimed there were no waiting lists for college places in Scotland. He boasted that this information didn't exist because there were still spaces left for applicants to further education. Only a week later, the Herald was able to establish that over 21,000 individuals are on waiting lists and subsequently are without a place on a course of their choice. Certainly.
I don't recognise the allegation that I said there was no waiting list. What I said was that these were not waiting lists that could be relied on because they didn't tell you that these were... I wonder if I could, Presiding Officer, they did not actually reflect what was taking place. And could you also note that the Herald specifically said that the 21,000 was not a figure that could be relied on, so I think you should be cautious about using it, and that is within the Herald copy.
McTaggart.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, but I'm sure that, if the Cabinet Secretary is saying that over the 21,000 figure hasn't to be relied on, I think it was 21,548 they specifically said. And also on that point, the concept of waiting lists is utterly false. Was your words, Cabinet Secretary? I'll continue, Presiding Officer. This is the reality of the Scottish Government's savage cuts to the further education sector in Scotland. Another concerning consequence of the Scottish Government's attack on colleges is the falling numbers of female students, in particular, who often rely on the availability of evening and weekend courses to balance family commitments and responsibilities. These courses are not being supported by the Scottish Government, and as a result, women are disproportionately affected and too often excluded altogether. In a time of economic hardship, when 25% of young people are without employment, it is unbelievable that student numbers should have fallen by 70,000 in just 2 years. The Cabinet Secretary cannot explain why this happened, but it is clear that his campaign of cuts against the further education sector is the source of this disastrous reality. Colleges are continuing to struggle against the challenges that they now face by implementing programmes to widen access and engage with their communities, but without proper support from Scottish Government, the effects will sadly be limited. Our further education sector has the potential to provide those from deprived and disadvantaged backgrounds with a high standard of education and equip them for future employment. However, as a result of such poor resourcing, colleges are unable to provide the level of support and access that they would aspire to. I ask the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary to seriously consider a re-evaluation of their policies on funding situation of further education and talk to the students and the colleges in order to address the serious failings in the support provided by this Government.
Thank you very much. Now calling Claire Adamson to be followed by Margaret McCulloch. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's very useful for us to actually not forget that the college reforms were to put learners at the centre. The college regionalisation model is improving the outcomes for our young people. And for the first time with the implementation of outcome agreements with the regions, we'll be able to really monitor and have a view of that progress. It's also about widening access, which has been discussed already, improved articulation from further to higher education, and also about our guarantee to young people of a place in either training, education or employment. And that's why the modern apprenticeship system has been expanded, and we have over 25,000 modern apprentices this year. And we're also looking to an advanced apprenticeship framework to help employers develop staff all the way through to degree level. And it's been mentioned by both Liz Smith this afternoon and Anne McTaggart about the drop in female participation in colleges. And I think it's very relevant that we should mention that there's a 16% increase in the number of females actually undertaking modern apprenticeships. And this is all about what the government priorities have been. And at the heart of the government priorities is also improved student support. Robin Parker of the NUS said in response to the spending review, "At the last election, the Scottish Government committed to increase student support, protect places at colleges and university, to rule out tuition fees, and this budget confirms that the Scottish Government have listened to the students of Scotland with proposals for a £7,000 minimum. I'm in the middle of a quote, I will take it after the quote. With proposals for a £7,000 minimum income for poorest students, the protection of the EMA for young students and pupils, and the confirmation of plans to keep education free of tuition fees and to increase funds for universities to match funding with England. Taken together, these proposals are a major step in the right direction towards making access to education in Scotland fairer."
Neil Finlay.
How does she then explain the 100,000 of Robin Parker's members who contacted MSPs last year complaining about the Scottish Government's policy on colleges? 100,000.
Claire Adamson.
I think that figure is widely disputed, Mr Finlay, but I'm happy to take the quote. I'm happy to take the quote from Robin Parker, who's fully supported these proposals. But, Presiding Officer, Robin Parker does mention the EMA, and it's been mentioned by Stuart Maxwell already. And it is vitally important because, of course, the EMA has been cut south of the border, along with a 32% cut in college budgets. So it's somewhat ironic that the Conservatives have chosen to bring this motion to this chamber. And if it is about priorities, can I also say that one of the priorities of the Scottish Government has been, for the first time, to give a minimum income guarantee to students of £7,250 to all Scottish domiciled undergraduates. Yes.
Hugh Henry.
Minimum income guarantee, minimum income which includes loans. I don't know if the member, like me, has a mortgage. My mortgage is not part of my income. Why for students? Why for students is a loan part of their income?
The minimum income guarantee has been welcomed by the NUS, and it certainly is more welcome than backdoor tuition fees that were introduced by his party. Can I also say that the Conservative motion calls on the Scottish Government to refocus its budget priorities. But which budgets are the Conservatives suggesting we refocus this money from? It's not principled to come to the Chamber with demands for spending without recognising that Conservative Lib Dem government has inflicted cumulative cuts in Scotland's budget of £10.4 billion in real terms over 4 years, £6.6 billion cuts to the revenue budget, £3.7 billion of cuts to the capital budget. Can I say that this government, when it comes to maintaining the support for students, they have, since 2007, the SNP has increased the baseline college support by 25%, up to £84.2 million. In 2003-14, they are allocating an additional £11.4 million to ensure that college student bursary budgets is maintained at over £95 million, and that represents over 40% more than the level when Joanne Lamont was the Scottish Executive Minister for Education. Presiding Officer, in Central Scotland we have many outstanding colleges and learning environments of the highest quality thanks to the investment made over the past years in our colleges. Coatbridge College is about to open a brand new spectacular business and conference centre, and their summer celebration where the college recently welcomed staff and families to celebrate their newly refurbished campus. And I would like to finish just with a quote from the David Hume Institute report entitled Scottish FE and the Sector, and they said that the key conclusion is that further education colleges contain a broader mix of students in terms of age, they have a higher proportion of disabled students from poorer backgrounds than at HE, and a more flexible learning route for students, suggesting that our further education colleges play an important role in promoting social inclusion.
Thanks very much. Now call on Margaret McCulloch to be followed by George Adam. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before coming to this Parliament in my professional life, I was a training consultant and also an external verifier for SQA. Most of my career was actually spent working with people to help them to train for employment and to improve their skills, but also to assess training providers and to monitor how they delivered qualifications. My career took me to colleges all over Scotland, and over the past 18 months, I have been working with colleges in my own region, listening to them as they go through this period of transition, helping them to find valuable work experience opportunities and getting them more involved in the community. I'm every bit as aware of the shortcomings of the sector as I am of their strengths and also their achievements. I agree that there needs to be reform, and I welcome a sharper focus on employment. I hope that colleges in every part of Scotland can build meaningful partnerships with employers and other providers in their local communities, guiding us back towards full employment. However, the good work that our colleges do, and that the Scottish Government want our colleges to do, has been undermined because of the spending reductions, which are entirely disproportionate. Not only were colleges hit hard in last year's budget, but the pressures are ongoing. Scotland's colleges have warned members of a cut in their teaching grant since 2010-11 of almost £73 million. Next year, the grant is expected to fall again. There is a serious drive for efficiency in the sector, but cuts of almost 16% within such a short period of time can't be delivered through efficiencies. The structural changes that colleges are going through, which are leading to mergers in some parts of the country and a federation of colleges in Lanarkshire, are expected to deliver long-term savings, but there can be no doubt that they present an immediate challenge. We've been hearing today about Audit Scotland's report, and I agree we need to know where the savings are to be found and how exactly they are to be delivered. However, we need to know much more about how these reforms and the Government's budget decisions are going to impact on those who depend most on the opportunities that a college education can provide. Over 30% of college students come from the most deprived parts of Scotland. The majority are women at a time when women's employment has been hit hard by recession, and the average age of the male college student is just 20 at a time when the country faces crisis level of youth employment. My fear is that a rush to reform at the same time as budgets are being slashed so severely is going to compromise provision for those who need it most when they need it most. The Scottish Government also announced a new employability fund earlier this year, transferring £24 million from the Scottish Funding Council to STS to replace the new College Learning Programme. In my experience, the College Learning Programme has been one of the most positive and interesting initiatives developed in response to the youth jobs crisis in Scotland. It consists of 192 hours college learning and 192 hours work experience with an employability certificate at the end of the course, and for some learners, the opportunity to progress into work. The programme depends in many ways on the participation of employers willing to offer placements. Working with South Lanarkshire College, I secured the participation of First Bus and ScotRail, and right now young people in my region are going through job-focused employability courses. I'm looking forward to meeting with the current group at the end of the course so that students can tell me about their experience and I can take a balanced view. But with the Employability Fund, it looks as if changes are being made before the programme has had the chance to bed in. I would ask the Scottish Government to explain why the programme has changed so soon, what the difference between the new College Learning Programme and the Employability Fund will be, and how these very positive initiatives are affected by the wider programme of college reforms. Presiding Officer, Scotland's colleges are under pressure as never before, just when they are needed most. Their work has never been so vital, yet their future has never been so unclear. The message that goes out from this Parliament today has to be that we recognise the contribution of our colleges and that we will support them and their students through these tough times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on George Adam to be followed by Liam MacArthur. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The reality here is that despite cuts passed down from Westminster, the Scottish Government is investing in colleges and bringing about reform that will strengthen the sector and its skills provision. The reality is the Scottish Government is investing in our young people when other governments in the United Kingdom aren't. And there are a number of key points that we have to have been already brought up. And when we talk about some of the information brought forward by Scottish colleges, we have to ask ourselves as well that during some of the evidence with the actual committee, there was some problems with their figures. They did in the past actually lose 10,000 students in one of their... They apologised for it, but they did get their figures wrong. So I think it's only right that we have an audit on these just to finally put this issue to bed once and for all. But it's quite hypocritical for the Tories. While the Scottish Tories, just when you think they couldn't get any lower, they managed to find an even lower point. But it is quite hypocritical for them to oppose college cuts when their UK colleagues are actually going for harsher cuts and an agenda to withdraw public support from the FE sector in the United Kingdom. Cutting at FE in England from 32.3% in 2010-11. But despite these unprecedented cuts being passed down to Scotland from the UK Government, the reality of the situation is that the Scottish Government are maintaining college student support at record levels. The Scottish Government are protecting student numbers in further education and maintaining full-time equivalent teaching activity. These are the important facts. It will not surprise anyone here that there's obviously a difference in the ideals between the Scottish Government and that one that's in Westminster. And as I've already mentioned, it was typically hypocritical of the Tories to actually discuss this matter when they are making such harsh cuts down south. But the UK Government are cutting FE and have control of their own budget, where we have our budget cut and we do not have control of our own budget.
Mel Goldie. Microphone, please.
Does the member think there is any logic to a college in Greenock merging with a college in his hometown of Paisley, merging with a college across the Clyde in Clydebank? Because if the Cabinet Secretary's logic is sustainable, we might as well close all three and have a new college in Erskine Bridge.
Well, I would answer the member by saying, don't ask me, ask the actual principals of these three colleges, because every one of them think it's the best way forward. But I will never apologise for saying back to the Scotland issue, because for me, that is the way forward. But the Scottish Government will continue to offer its education for everyone, no matter your financial background, and opportunities for all, not just for those that can afford it, like down south. The UK Government's further education budget will be cut by £1.1 billion over the spending review period, while we have the Tories here asking for the Scottish Government, with our limited budget, to actually give some more, at the same time not offering what they would do instead. But the difference is in student support. During the evidence we got from Robin Parker, he was the NUS Scotland president. He believes that it's fantastic the amount of financial assistance being offered to students, and he believes that it's better than anything else that they receive down south. And my colleagues that are on the committee will obviously admit to that, because they were there when he actually said it. But I think we have to look at what we're doing and what's happening here. We're taking a strategic vision for Scotland's future, training for jobs. Reed Kerr College in Paisley are training people for new green energy boom. Dusan Babcock and Renfrew are producing much of the technology used in the renewable sector. Will benefit from these young people when they actually leave that college. And Reed Kerr have invested £4 million in a state-of-the-art building for engineering construction recently, because they are being focused and strategic. In this ever-changing economic climate, there can be massive shifts from manufacturing to service sector in the last 3 years, and it's important that colleges lead the way in training people for jobs that are needed, and obviously backing up what was said from the various business sector when they came to the committee. And there is a need for college reform, because there's many people within the actual college sector themselves who believe that reform is the way forward. I've recently spoken to the Reed Kerr College, Audrey Cumberford, and she has backed the idea that this is the way forward for her college. Now, college reserves were brought up during various debates that we've had, and the recent Audit Scotland report mentioned that Scotland's colleges totalled £206 million at the end of 2011, and another figure of £98.9 million from 2006-07. Now, when you look at these figures, it's not just the Scottish Government that obviously the Cabinet Secretary quite rightly says has to pay for this. For me, the important issue is how we take Scotland's colleges forward. ensuring that every 16 to 19-year-old gets the opportunity of work, education or training, building a solid foundation in the lives of Scotland's young people. I have a vested interest because I have an 18-year-old daughter who's at college. And this debate has shown that there are stark differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK on education. And I will take this Cabinet Secretary's attitude towards education and how we will deliver it any day of the week when compared to others.
Thank you very much. Now call on Liam MacArthur to be followed by Marco Biaggi. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome today's debate. Congratulate Liz Smith on bringing it and confirm we'll be supporting both the motion and Hugh Henry's amendment this afternoon. The Government's amendment, however, is another matter. As well as deleting any reference to the benefits of, quote, extending further education opportunities to a wider cross-section of society, it bears many of the hallmarks of the my way or the highway approach displayed by its author over recent days. I will turn to the main issues under the debate this afternoon shortly, but let me first reflect on the astonishing events that have undermined, I think, confidence in the judgment of the Education Secretary and morale within Scotland's college sector. Mr Russell takes great pleasure in reminding us of his lack of power of direction over colleges. He rejoices in what he sees as the delicious irony that a Labour minister removed this power during Mr Russell's sabbatical from Parliament. Yet, by summoning the chair of Stowe College to a meeting last week and demanding his resignation, Mr Russell effectively assumed a power of direction by proxy. Mr Ramsay's decision to step down simply confirms this. Mr Russell's statement today claiming that it is, quote, a matter for the management of the board of Stowe College and he, quote, respects Mr Ramsay's decision is beyond parody. Claims of bullying by Mr Russell and a climate of fear across the college sector are now a consistent theme and not just on the basis of this week's events. Ministers are quite within their rights to make clear what they expect to be delivered by whom and in what timeframe. However, it is increasingly obvious that Mr Russell is unable to resist the temptation to micromanage every aspect of what goes on across his portfolio. As a final comment for now on this sorry saga, I believe the treatment of Kurt Ramsay and the wider concerns it raises are ones the Education Committee of this Parliament must investigate. For now, however, let me focus the remainder of my remarks on some more general thoughts relating to the challenges facing our college sector and the contribution it makes to our economy. Over the last 24 hours, the Education Committee has met twice to hammer out an agreement over its report on the Scottish Government's budget. This does not in any way reflect a disagreement between us about the importance of colleges locally and nationally in delivering, amongst other things, our shared ambition of sustainable economic growth in this country. It does, however, reflect serious concerns some of us have, concerns shared by colleges, NUS and a range of other witnesses, that delivering such an ambition is potentially hamstrung by the approach the Government is taking towards funding, reorganisation and other pressures being applied to our colleges. In addition, the way in which ministers are driving through the reform agenda and targeting spending in a sharply reducing budget risks disproportionately impacting some of those groups to which colleges have been particularly adept at extending access and opportunities. This is one of the key themes picked up in the David Hume Institute report referred to by other members. As well as evidencing the economic value of colleges to the Scottish economy, the report underscores the success of our colleges in, as the authors put it, reaching parts of the society that other components of our education system find hard to reach. And yet, as NUS points out, shifts in college participation away from part-time to full-time, from mature students to young students and from women to men do have implications for participation and accessibility. This is particularly the case for older learners and women who rely heavily on college courses to reskill and gain entry back into the labour market. That role for colleges is vital. As the David Hume report observes, by boosting skills, productivity and earnings, colleges contribute up to 1% of GDP over an 8-year period. Yet, despite this contribution, the Scottish Government has chosen to significantly reduce funding to the sector over the current spending review period. In evidence to the Education Committee, each of the college unions, Scottish colleges and NUS all warned of the potential impact this could have on Scotland's economic recovery. In its briefing for today's debate, NUS Scotland draws attention to the planned £34 million cut in college budgets and states, quote, given the importance of colleges to the future of Scotland's economy, we would urge the Scottish Government to consider ways the funding settlement for colleges can be improved to prevent the damage the proposed cuts could cause. Of course, in dismissing these concerns, Mr Russell points to regionalisation and the savings he expects to be generated. But again, there is a problem, not in terms of regionalisation per se, but in the scale of any future savings and the timeframe in which they can be realised. Audit Scotland zeroes in on this concern in its report, which also makes clear the scale of the challenges facing the sector. That is not to deny the need or even the desire for change, but as Mr Peat observes, change must not be at the cost of the crucial role the colleges play in providing opportunities to many from diverse parts of society, nor must the crucial close relationships with local businesses be placed at risk. I hope I've not ensured that Jeremy Peat is the next to be invited in for a cosy fireside chat with the Cabinet Secretary, but believe he is right when he says this is a difficult time for the sector, facing the challenges of coping with constraints on funding, implementing rapid and substantial organisation change, and of playing a key role in meeting the Government's opportunity for all commitment, although Mr Peat may want to not answer his phone, perhaps for a wee while yet. I have no difficulty with many of the objectives set by the Government, but I am alarmed that, as well as dismissing individual college chairs, Mr Russell is determined to dismiss any and all concerns being raised by the college sector. Last year, Deputy Presiding Officer, Mr Russell was the last man in Government left defending the initial budget settlement as, quote, full, final and fair. I hope he will not make the same mistake twice, but as recent events prove, he is not a man who ever finds it easy to say I'm wrong.
Thank you very much. I now call on Marco Biaggi to be followed by Mary Scanlon. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just before I go into full flow, I do reflect on some of Liam MacArthur's comments, and I do wonder what would happen to an MSP who took a recording of a committee session that was not being broadcast to the public and then passed that recording around. I think such an MSP would quickly find themselves in front of the Standards Committee, but that is a discussion for another day. In looking at the original contribution by the Conservative spokesperson on this issue, I was waiting very clearly for a sentence that I knew was coming. And it started when it was, we accept that there is a cut to the budget, and of course that the Scottish Government must make cuts and that there are difficult decisions. And I was waiting for that key word, that but that was coming. It's like the but you get in the lines about wind farms being good, but immigration being helpful, but we've got to keep it down, and budgets are tight, but we still disagree with your spending and you should find more money. Now, Liz Smith talked about voices being raised, and I noticed from the contributions that I got sent from NUS Scotland, from Scotland's colleges, what I would represent as constructive engagement, suggestions for ways to manage a difficult process of change rather than head-on attacks on the process. I also have quotes here from some great enthusiasts for the changes that are going on. These changes will present us all with a fantastic opportunity to create something new and exciting. Jeff Fenlon. We will continue to improve lives by realising our aspirations. We look to the future with ambition in our eyes. John Burke, Angus College. And I do wonder from the Conservatives if this is a case of do as we say, not as we do. You know, the Lib Dems are often frequent proponents of hiding behind the fig leaf of federalism, but the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. They are the same party here as they are south of the border. And south of the border, they are reducing FE college budgets by 32.3%. These are difficult times, but we also see from the Audit Scotland report between 2007 and 2011 that college reserves went up from 98.9 million to 206.4 million. In these difficult times, you must look at all the options when solutions are thin on the ground. And I know what the Conservative interpretation of all the options would be. It's right there in the 2010 spending review. In further and higher education, the Government believes that there must be a shift away from public spending towards greater contributions from those that benefit most and who can afford to pay. If that is what the Conservatives wish to introduce in Scotland, they should be open and say so. Furthermore, I'm a little bit surprised by the Labour approach to defending the current status quo. The status quo is as set out in the 1992 Further and Higher Education Act. I delved into the history of Scottish affairs in a moment. In Scottish Affairs in 1995, where Professor Walter Humes described them thus: underlying the reforms were certain recurring themes. These themes had, of course, already been developed in England via NHS reforms and the privatisation of public services. Forsyth, unlike his colleagues at the Scottish Office, sought to advance swiftly and boldly along similar lines. If Mr Findlay would like, or Mr Henry would like to defend Thatcherite reforms from Michael Forsyth, they may do so.
Hugh Henry.
Marco Biaggi has just said that Labour opposed the reforms. I actually think he must have been sleeping when I was talking to the Chamber, because I said quite clearly we welcome change and there had to be change. So I don't know what he's talking about, but I suspect neither does he.
Marco Biaggi.
Well, if Mr Henry thinks this is his idea of supporting changes, I'd hate to see his idea of opposing them. Because, as well, looking back at recent events, it's not just the SNP that have looked at changes. The Labour government at the UK level has done so in the same way. The Foster Review, realising the potential in 2005 for the UK government, pointed at a complex landscape with duplication, issues of dropout rates. And interestingly, the author said afterwards, basically, I am nobody's dinner guest in FE any longer because I have been quite critical and challenging. Indeed, proposing changes does not tend to win you many friends. But there is a consensus of the value on FE very widely. And I think looking at the situation, we see the weighted student unit of measurement target stable, the full-time equivalent stable, and so the opponents of change having to grapple for the issue of headcount, which is a misleading figure. Similarly, the statistics for the changes in funding have continually been revised by critics, leading to a suggestion that there is no stable and consensus figure. We face difficulties in all areas of budgets. Behind every decision there is a human story, and today all of our constituents are facing the challenges, the impacts of UK government decisions in all their walks of lives. We are facing the same here in Parliament. And I would agree with the Conservatives that there are no easy choices, and I would hope that they would respect the reality of that statement and respect that this is a difficult process that has been managed to the best of ability, and support the government in their endeavours.
Many thanks. Now call on Mary Scanlon to be followed by Mike Mackenzie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would refer members to my register of interest. I'm very happy to accept the Cabinet Secretary's offer for an update meeting on further education. I think if we can work together on Isla's health services, then I'm sure we can do the same on further education. I'm very pleased to speak to the motion in the name of my colleague Liz Smith. Further education colleges wholeheartedly deserve our support and praise, given how much they have achieved in raising the bar for education and training opportunities since incorporation in 1992. And whilst I can see the benefits of some college mergers, this sector is one of Scotland's great successes. It is certainly not a sector of failure. But I substituted for Liz Smith at a recent committee meeting discussing further and higher education. And despite doing my homework, I found a plethora of figures giving a confused account of the real cuts. When Neil Findlay asked Professor Jeremy Peat, Professor Gallagher and Paul Buchanan to give the committee one figure for the cuts, they were unable to do so, despite all their efforts. So if eminent economists and college principals find difficulty interpreting the government's figures, then surely this has to be worrying for the rest of us. Jeremy Peat confirmed that FE is a priority for the economy, and the cuts are putting severe strains on this sector at a time where there is a need to work at both ends of the labour market, for those entering and preparing for work, and for the many who need readjustment training throughout their careers in order to participate in a difficult and complex economy. The briefing paper from Scotland's colleges for this debate states that the teaching grant has fallen by 73 million, nearly 16% in the last 2 years. The Auditor-General stated a reduction of 24% in real terms of the Government's revenue grant support over the current spending review period, against a background of increasing demand for college places and rising maintenance and energy costs, and I would also add a six-fold increase in pension costs at this time. And then we see that £24 billion has been transferred from the Funding Council's FE budget to Skills Development Scotland. Now, this transfer of funds from the colleges to SDS is now ring-fenced for colleges. But like so many of the other financial transactions in this confused landscape, the college paper says no details of the fund have yet been provided. So my question is, why has money been taken out of the FE budget and given to Skills Development Scotland only to be ring-fenced for FE? Could the funds not just have stayed in further, could the funds not just have stayed in further education in the first place, rather than taking them out, putting them in another organisation and then filtering them back to FE? It's hardly surprising that we're bamboozled at this. But the main concerns are the impact the cuts will have on education and training opportunities, and more importantly, as many members have mentioned, the widening of the inequalities gap. Over 30% of college students come from the most deprived areas, as Margaret McCulloch said. In colleges serving the most deprived areas, this can be over 70%. And with 70,000 less students in the 2 years between 8-9 and 10-11, there can be no doubt that opportunities out of poverty are being lost. And I don't believe that all these people were pursuing hobbies in flower arranging and basket weaving. I think that's quite insulting to 70,000 students who can no longer access further education. But my main point, as I raised at the committee, is in articulation. Having lectured economics for 20 years in further and higher education before coming here, I am aware that many students, particularly mature students, do not want to commit to a 4-year degree programme. A higher national certificate can be achieved in 1 year, an HND in 2 years. These programmes are more flexible now, with many modules being achieved by distance learning. Students in the last 20 years can either do the degree in FE or enter in second or third year at university.
1 minute left.
So whether the cut to FE teaching is 16% or 25%, how can the government expect colleges to provide the same number of courses, teach and train the same number of students and maintain the same excellent standards as they have been doing? Already FE colleges are expected and do achieve the same quality standards for a degree as universities. Yet, as Professor Gallagher stated, there is a major funding gap in the funding of university degrees and the funding of FE colleges. So why are the colleges being cut again? And my final point, as I've got so little time left, at this time, when further education is most needed, it is tragic if training, education and preparation for the labour market is lost, and it is being lost, and the fault and responsibility of that is with this government.
Thank you very much. I now call Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Presiding Officer, in reading Liz Smith's motion, I found it very hard to believe that this motion comes from the same Tory party, that same party that are in the process of savaging the UK further education budget, as Marco Biaggi has told us, by 32%, or he said 32.3%. And that's a real terms cut, so it's difficult to reconcile that. Perhaps they've wakened up from, not at the moment, thanks, perhaps they've wakened up from their long slumber, and they imagine that we're now in an independent Scotland, where it might be credible for them, for the Scottish Tories to do one thing, or say one thing, and the Tories south of the border to do another thing. Or perhaps they're just undaunted by Mr Obama's recent election victory, and they're merely following Mitt Romney's maxim that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and these are the ones we need to concentrate on. But whatever the reason, the people of Scotland will not be fooled, as they have not been fooled by the Tories for many years. Not, in fact, since the last time there was major reform of the further education sector, nearly 20 years ago. And it's worth reflecting, I think, on the shortcomings of that previous system, where each college competed against its neighbours as if they were businesses in a free market, and where the concerns of education were often overshadowed by the concerns of business. And the reason why this could never work is that they laboured under the restrictions of a zero-sum game, whereas genuine business relies on growth and open economies. Certainly.
Mary Scanlon.
Competition there is in the area that you and I represent, in the Highlands and Islands.
Mike McKenzie.
I think if you're prepared to listen to my speech, I'll come and deal with that very point. And often in this previous system, success was measured by the success of the institution, but not always by the success of the students. Some few colleges may have done well under this system, but others most certainly did not. And in answer to Mary's point, I've got personal experience from my previous life in business, when we used to have to send apprentices to a college in the central belt of Glasgow. And this particular college was not doing well in business terms, although it would be unfair to name it. We had, as I have said, I had no choice. And of course, I can see the Cabinet Secretary wondering at what I'm getting at here. So I should add that this was before. Be patient. I should add that this was before the flourishing Argyll College was established under the stewardship of Michael Breslin, the recently retired Chief Executive. And members, they'll be pleased to know that Mr Breslin is now putting his considerable talents to good use as an SNP councillor. But back to the answer for Mary, because our apprentices received almost nothing in the way of education or training at this struggling college in the Central Belt. And more than once I had first-year apprentices quite proudly tell me, they used to do it often, that they had to show the lecturers how to do things. And on one occasion, not at the moment, because I'm still really answering Mary's point.
Could you use full names, please?
On one occasion, I refused to sign off training modules as the apprentices had agreed with me that they'd not achieved competency in these areas. The following week, the head of the department phoned me, and he explained to me that I was missing the point. And the point was that from his business perspective, he would not receive the funding unless I signed off the modules that week. And so he had no real concern for training and every concern for his budget and for money. And I can only assume that this became a more general problem, because the following year they discontinued the practice of employers having to sign off training objectives. Presiding Officer, I could go on at much more length, certainly.
Neil Findlay.
Very interesting story, but can I say that my experience as a tradesman and an apprentice was completely different from that. I had fantastic training, a fantastic education at West Lothian College. So you may have one isolated case, but to pick that as what happened all over the sector is just rubbish.
Mike McKenzie, 1 minute left.
I didn't say that. I said some colleges did well and others didn't. I mean, I could go on for length, a bit more examples. And you'll be glad to hear that I'm not going to do that. And I must really pay a tribute to the Cabinet Secretary, because he's in the process of pulling off that most difficult of tasks, the task of making a virtue out of necessity. Because we can't pretend that the Scottish budget is not being cut. And the only way in which we can continue to deliver high-quality educational outcomes whilst protecting student numbers is in doing away with the unnecessary duplication that resulted in much wasted effort and in neighbouring colleges sometimes struggling with half-full classrooms as they competed with each other for students. I'll wind up then, Presiding Officer, and just in winding up, I must pause to reflect that Hugh Henry's amendment seeks to add only one very small sentence to the Tory motion.
You really must stop.
Perhaps these two parties really are better together, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell them apart.
Thank you. Members must keep to the 6 minutes. Neil Bibby to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the debate this afternoon because there is an absolute need for us to highlight what is going on in our colleges. Often I would say I'm delighted to speak in debates, but I can't say I'm delighted today. I can't say it because I take no delight in highlighting the effect the SNP government's cuts are having on jobs, student numbers and courses. Yesterday the SNP claimed that the Labour Party is bringing forward a Cuts Commission. What we want is an honest debate about public services, and the truth is, Presiding Officer, the cuts are happening in our colleges right now. I know the impact these cuts are having. They're taking away opportunities from young people. They're taking away opportunities for people who women who wish to study part-time, and opportunities for people with learning disabilities. I've spoken to many of these students and to the staff about the effects these are having on them. Worryingly, Audit Scotland identified the true extent of these cuts in its recent report into the challenges facing the college sector, stating that the Scottish Government's revenue support grant in colleges is likely to fall from £545 million in 2011-12 to £471 million in 2014-15. This is a real terms reduction of a staggering 24%. And figures produced by SPICE show that funds for teaching have been reduced from £469 million in academic year 2010-11 to £396 million in academic year 2012-13, with more to come next. In my own region of the west of Scotland, these cuts are having a serious impact. Reed Kerr College in Paisley has seen its teaching grant cut from £14.4 million in 2011-12 to £13 million in 2012-13. That's a reduction of nearly 10% and over £1 million. The same can be said for Clydebank College. The SNP might try their best to keep these figures out of the public spotlight, but no amount of smoke and mirrors can disguise the impact these cuts are having in our colleges. And that's just last year. There are more cuts on their way. Would you like to give an answer?
Mark MacDonald.
Well, in the spirit of the honest debate that Mr Bibby claims to want, he will know that in order to increase funding in colleges from within a fixed budget, he must therefore reduce funding elsewhere. So what would he cut in order to replace the funding in the college budgets? I see Mr Henry is offering some advice in that regard.
Neil Bibby.
Are you accepting a 24% cut in colleges, Mr MacDonald? The fact of the matter is we need to have that debate about what our priorities are, and your priorities aren't cutting our colleges because you're cutting colleges more than practically any other budget. You know the SNP government claimed their budget was a budget for growth and jobs. What a nonsense. We have high levels of unemployment and people aren't getting the chance to retrain for another job. No wonder the AIS, Unison and the NUS have all said that the government's cuts to colleges will put economic recovery at risk. No wonder businesses are telling us that colleges can't provide them with the services they need. It's not because colleges are incapable, but because of the severe cuts they are having to deal with. It's obvious pretty much to everyone, apart from this government, that you do not cut colleges and retraining opportunities during an economic downturn. You don't cut courses for young people when there's a youth unemployment crisis and 100,000 young people cannot get a job. We've heard this afternoon about the disproportionate effect and shocking impact the government's cuts are having on women. The government's decision to withdraw funding for many part-time, weekend and evening courses is also having a devastating impact on people with learning disabilities. Part-time courses, which I think it's insulting to suggest, as Joan McAlpine has done, that a reduction would be in part-time courses, some of which would be flower arranging courses for herself for an hour a week. The fact of the matter is, we have a duty to protect and support the vulnerable. It is therefore shocking that research by the Scottish Consortium for Learning... I'll give way to Joan McAlpine.
Joan McAlpine.
Is the member seriously arguing that large numbers of part-time hobby courses, as the Cabinet Secretary said, were being provided in the past is really equivalent and appropriate for a time of high youth unemployment, compared to a focus on young people and giving opportunities for all, which is what the focus now is.
I don't think part-time courses for women that have been slashed, I don't think part-time courses for people with learning disabilities are hobby courses, and I think it's absolutely insulting to refer to it in that way. Because I'll tell you, people with learning disabilities, part-time courses have been cut by 34%, from 2,155 to 1,413 in those colleges that responded to the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability. Some colleges have even cut all of their part-time places for such courses. The SCLD report also makes clear that many people with learning disabilities were given very little notice that their college place had been cut. College courses form an important part of the lives of many people with learning disabilities. Presiding Officer, I want to highlight a response from students at Reed Care College in Paisley to the Scottish Government's cuts and a recent consultation on the success of the Same As You policy framework, which aims to support people with learning disabilities in order that they can lead full lives in their community. The final question asks, what are the things we need to do in the future in order to make the lives of people with learning disabilities better? The response simply says, bring back more college places, more courses and more staff. It's about time the Cabinet Secretary and his government started listening.
I now call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I think it was Neil Findlay in his intervention to Mike Mackenzie said that the picture is perhaps not the same in every college across the country. And perhaps I'm going to paint a rather more positive picture than I think I just heard from Neil Bibby, because I think that was one of the most negative pictures I've heard. And when we've heard that there's perhaps a consensus, even with the Labour Party, when reform is actually necessary, I think we need to try and look at how we address that reform and how we remain positive. In the Aberdeen and Banff-and-Buchan colleges, Presiding Officer, they entered into a contract, not a merger, a contract of actually trying to achieve the best for their students within looking at the workplace within that whole area of the north east of Scotland. They're responding to the need for skills, responding to a need that has been crying out by the business sector. The colleges are responding positively. Let me say that Banff-and-Buchan probably responded the most positive, because they responded in a way that I think they need to be commended for. They tackled the gender aspect of the STEM subjects for women. They introduced specific training for young girls. They targeted their courses specifically towards getting young women into these courses. They're working with the industry. They're working with Shell, BP, TACA, all the industries within the North East to try and engender the skills for the future. And in Aberdeen College, they responded in the same way. They're going out to businesses. They're seeking with the business. And in a federation, basically, of the colleges and the universities now, looking at where the skills are needed and are providing the appropriate courses to meet those skills. The Cabinet Secretary, opportunities for all. It is opportunities for all. And in answer to Mr Bibby, not every college turns their back on learning disabilities. And I would actually think it's absolutely unacceptable for any college to turn their back on any person with learning disabilities, any disability, or any equality agenda issue. Can I... Absolutely.
Neil Bibby.
The Scottish Consortium for Learning Disabilities has conducted a survey which shows that part-time courses for people with learning disabilities has been cut by 34%, and in some colleges, all of the part-time places for such courses have been cut. I would recommend to Mr Robinson that he gets a copy of that report and looks into this matter.
Dennis Robertson.
Presiding Officer, maybe I should inform Mr Bibby that I can read these reports. Mr Bibby, can I just suggest that you also said it was on the respondents to that survey? And can I also say, Mr Bibby, that I'll go back to Banff-and-Buchan College. They have specifically got courses for people with learning disabilities to get them back into the community and to work that is meaningful and the work that they can do within their communities. And it's the same for Aberdeen College. Aberdeen College, again, have to be commended for the Equality Action Plan that they have. They're looking at all the equal opportunities across the whole spectrum. That's across gender, disability, ethnic minorities, etc. Now, if Aberdeen College can do it, Banff and Buchan can do it, I can't see why other colleges can't. And I think what I said, Mr Bibby, is I think it's abhorrent for any college to have turned their back on. You may quote statistics to me, but what I'm saying is I think it's unacceptable for any college to do that. And I would hope that the Cabinet Secretary would address that problem with any college that is doing that, Mr Bibby. Can I say, Presiding Officer, the examples in the North East is in respect and in response to what the business community are asking for. Every college in this country can do the same. Reform is necessary. And the examples I've given with Aberdeen and Banff and Buchan are to be commended, and I would give them as exemplars to other colleges within this sector.
Thank you. I now call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Mark MacDonald. But before Mr Fraser speaks, can I remind people to speak through the chair and use full names? Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week we saw the latest extraordinary twist in the Cabinet Secretary's war on Scotland's colleges. The facts, as far as we know, are as follows. One individual, the chair of a college board, in a meeting of some 80 to 100 people, recorded the Cabinet Secretary's speech for future reference. On hearing this, the Cabinet Secretary apparently had a tantrum, ejected his toys from the pram, called the chair of the college in question to a meeting, apparently was reluctant even to shake his hand, and demanded his head. These are not the actions, Presiding Officer, of a responsible minister maintaining an arm's-length relationship with the sector, but those of a school playground bully. And they are all too typical of a Cabinet Secretary used to throwing his weight around and getting his own way, slashing budgets, forcing mergers, and now petulantly demanding resignations, typifying the SNP's contemptuous approach to the education sector, and in particular the attitude of Mr Russell. A few weeks ago, the Cabinet Secretary came to this chamber and had the grace to stand up and say, in relation to another matter, that he was wrong. I would he had the same grace and self-awareness to do the same today on this particular issue. We are here to discuss the very important questioning of widening access in further education, an agenda under threat from unprecedented cuts to the sector of £73 million across 2 years to the teaching grant. Yes, of course, I'll give way. Yes.
Claire Adamson.
Mention unprecedented cuts. Is the 32% cut south of the border not a precedent?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, members notice we are in the Scottish Parliament discussing the actions of the Scottish Government in relation to Scotland's colleges, and which SNP members would focus on their responsibilities and the responsibilities of their government and their Cabinet Secretary. And we all know about the concern of these cuts. They've been expressed by the EIS, they've been expressed by Scotland's colleges, and they've been expressed by the National Union of Students. And we know the consequence of these cuts on the widening access agenda. The figures are absolutely clear. The participation rate in further education in Scotland from the 20% most deprived cohort has fallen from 83.3 per 1,000 in 2007-8 to 72.5 per 1,000 in 2010-11, and the latest trends, of course, suggest that will decline still further. And as we've heard throughout this debate, this has a disproportionate impact on women and a disproportionate impact on older learners. As Liz Smith pointed out earlier, there has been a 26% cut in the number of female learners since 2006-7, as opposed to a 13% drop for men. So it's falling at twice the rate, and the indications are that the existing changes going through are going to make the matter still worse. And we also know that because of the focus on providing education for those in the 16 to 21-year-old age range, older learners coming in, many of them who've been in the workforce, who've been made unemployed and are trying to retrain, cannot get college places because they're being allocated to the 16 to 21-year-olds, with real issues for the widening access agenda. Now, a number of members on the SNP benches have been questioning, quite legitimately questioning, this issue about refocusing the budget and where we would find the money. And we are absolutely clear where we stand on this. And let me spell it out for the benefit of SNP members. We know the FE College budget has been cut. It was raided to fund the universities. And we make no apology for saying again, as we have done, we favour a modest graduate contribution in order to put funding into the university system. Because what the SNP are doing is they are providing free university education for the better off at the expense of those from less well-off backgrounds who cannot get college places. These are the facts. And we hear the SNP mantra, we've heard it again today. These university tuition fees deter those from less well-off backgrounds. Well, I checked the figures. Oh, yes, I'm delighted to give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Let me put this as gently as I can. He knows, the member knows, presiding officer, that south of the border, 25,000 places have been lost in universities because of the fees that have been imposed. Evidence is also clear that the majority of those people deterred are those from the lowest incomes. So his proposal would actually narrow access to education.
Murdo Fraser.
The problem for the Cabinet Secretary is he is talking absolute nonsense. As ever, it is assertion and not facts. And I know that, presiding officer, because I checked the figures before I came to this chamber. The participation rate from the poorest 20% in England and Wales universities is 10.6%. In Scotland, the comparable figure is 9.1%. The participation from those from less well-off backgrounds in England and Wales is higher than it is in Scotland, notwithstanding tuition fees. So the idea that tuition fees will deter people from less well-off backgrounds, despite its continual assertion from the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues, is utterly false. Utterly false. Why? Because when the graduate contribution was brought in, it was brought in with generous bursary schemes from those from less well-off backgrounds, and that is undoubtedly the case on the latest figures. And the other consequence we know, and I'll mention this briefly in view of the time, is the cut in STEM subjects.
Yes,
an 18.5% cut in STEM subjects since 2007. To be building the Scottish economy, we need people training in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. We should be building up the places and not cutting them. It's time for this Cabinet Secretary to end his war on further education in Scotland, and it's time, frankly, for some humility in this chamber from him.
Thank you. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Hansala Malik.
Thank you very much, presiding officer. I mean the cheek of a Tory to tell us how we should go about rebuilding the Scottish economy. I mean, I know Murdo Fraser wanted to scrap the Conservative Party, and frankly, many around Scotland wish he'd managed to achieve his aim. Who knows, given the way things are going, he may yet get a second bite at that particular cherry. But I was pleased that Liz Smith acknowledged that there has been a cut to the Scottish budget. It was a welcome move, because her leader seldom ever does it, and neither, indeed, does her finance spokesperson acknowledge the cuts that are coming to the Scottish budget. Indeed, they go out of their way to pretend that it isn't happening. So I welcome the honesty brought to this debate by Liz Smith, were that some of her colleagues could take a leaf out of her book. But at the same time, she cannot realistically come to this Parliament and expect there to be changes made to the funding landscape without shifting it from other areas, and I accept the points that are being made there. But in terms of what the Conservatives are doing, is essentially the government in London, it ties our hands and picks our pockets. And that is what is happening to the Scottish budget, because we have our hands tied in terms of how we can go about growing the economy, while at the same time the budget of this Parliament is being reduced. And indeed, the leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland makes a speech where she calls for the tax take to be cut in Scotland, income tax to be cut in Scotland, not even just by the 1 pence, which would take £500 million out, so possibly more than £1 billion taken out of the Scottish budget. And then they have the nerve to come to this Parliament and demand that we reinstate funding in areas, while at the same time they're out there in the communities of Scotland calling for less money to be available to the Scottish Government. It is a deeply dishonest position to take, and they should at least have a little bit of humility when they come to this chamber and make these demands. So faced with the difficult choices which we are forced to take, and it's interesting how those who come to this chamber and say they want an honest debate about difficult choices are quick to run at the first sight of a debate about difficult choices, the Cabinet Secretary is driving forward reform of the sector. Indeed, the regional approach, I think, will bring great benefits not just to the sector but also to the learners, who of course must be the most important people in this. And it's worth noting that even in these difficult times and faced with these difficult decisions, there is still record funding being put into student support, which will ensure that those students from vulnerable backgrounds are able to access further education and not do so at a detriment, rather than the fees which are being applied south of the border, which are crippling some of those people's choices in terms of higher and further education. And I asked Neil Bibby when he was on his feet and he was having his little rant about the money that was being taken out of the college sector. And I said to him, in the spirit of the honest debate that he claims he and his party want to have, he has to reduce a budget in order to then consequentially increase a budget. And even when he phoned a friend and he had Mr Henry in his ear telling him the answer to give, he couldn't come up with an answer. And the reason is simple, is because it would then compromise one of his other front-bench spokespeople who come here and demand more money for their sector in order to appease the people that they seek to champion. And all they are doing to these people is deceiving them. They are deceiving them and leading them up the garden path that somehow, if the Labour Party had their hands on the levers of power, had their hands on the finances of this Parliament, that money would suddenly increase in availability and everyone could have more. Well, we don't live in that world. What we live in is a world where we have our hands tied. Well, indeed, Mr Johnson, if you want to offer an intervention to ask me that question, you're more than welcome to do so. But you've asked me there about the concept of independence. We know that with independence we would have the ability to take decisions in the economy, to use the full levers of the economy to grow our economy here in Scotland. We wouldn't be faced with the reductions in our capital budget, which your party is foisting upon us from Westminster, forcing us to take creative decisions within the Scottish budget in terms of shifting from resource to capital. That is, again, something which is welcome. And indeed, in looking at the shift from resource to capital, it's worth remembering the large amounts of capital funding that are being spent on colleges. And I often hear members poo-pooing this as if somehow it isn't relevant. But exactly the point is that, for example, the new state-of-the-art facility at Banff-and-Buchan College, and I would commend members from all parties to take the opportunity to visit the facility at Banff-and-Buchan College and see for themselves the improved staff morale within the building, the improved student experience within the building, and most crucially, the reduced running costs within the building, because in a time of revenue constraint, what you need to do is use your capital budget to reduce revenue running costs through development of either new facilities or, in the case of Aberdeen's Gallowgate College, refurbished facilities, which will allow you to take some of that revenue which you were using to run inefficient buildings and reinvest it in the front line instead. Ms Scanlon.
Mary Scanlon. For giving way, can I refer to paragraph 39 in Auditor General's report of last month? If capital funding is so wonderful, why is the Auditor General pointing out a real terms reduction of 45%?
Mark MacDonald, and you've less than a minute left.
I would direct the member to my previous comments regarding the decisions taken by her colleagues at Westminster to slash the capital budget that is available to this Parliament. Well, look, the Conservative Party cannot come to this chamber and expect us, without the controls on the economy, to somehow perform some form of financial magic and make more money appear. What we are doing is refocusing the college agenda, reforming and regionalising, but also delivering new facilities which will improve the learner experience. And we're also seeing in the North East a creative approach to partnership work with the private sector, which my colleague Dennis Robertson covered. That will deliver for learners. It should be welcomed.
Thank you. Before I call Hans-Ala Malik, can I remind the Chamber that members should not be shouting out from sedentary positions, and likewise members should not be responding to that. Hans-Ala Malik.
Thank you and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be able to speak at this debate this afternoon, as higher education is an area I have always been involved in historically. And I would like to wish Stowe College well and hope that they overcome the current issues that they face, and I hope it won't affect the morale of staff and students' academic futures. I have always been keen to promote the value of Scottish colleges within Glasgow, Scotland, and internationally. Scotland Agricultural College works in Lahore and other cities in Pakistan. City of Glasgow College works in Karachi and Lahore. So we have a proud history that we actually engage with cities and countries overseas. Our colleges do a wonderful job, and I want to thank them here for doing that and standing up to the current challenges. There can be no doubt that colleges provide access to education to a diverse range of people through flexible learning models and broad subject choice. This flexibility has an influence on social movement and models. Minority communities in particular benefit from this, and people with disabilities, students from diverse areas attend colleges and various universities. We have several college mergers that's taken place historically, and there are going to be more mergers. However, during these mergers, in the previous years, there has been support in transfer for models for our colleges. However, that's not going to happen on this occasion. What we're saying to our colleges is that they have to deal with these issues with current resources. That in itself is a challenge. It's a huge challenge and a huge burden for colleges to do that in a area of cuts. We are going through such harsh economic situation just now, and then to say to the colleges they have to actually deal with this themselves as well, I think is a huge burden on them. Moving on the issue of young people, as young people have to compete in an increasingly harsh labour market, there is also a rising demand for college places. Now we've heard that there is a waiting list of people wanting to go to colleges to retrain, and I've heard some various comments today about hobby courses. I don't know what hobby courses are. Any learning to me is learning, and I think that when people learn, they can actually apply themselves. We give a lot of credit and credence to industry and businesses. What we don't seem to understand is we're a country of entrepreneurs. There are people who are self-employed, who earn a great deal of respect and money for this country. And they also need education, and it doesn't need to be tunneled, focused. We need people to be able to choose subjects. Flexibility is important, choice of subjects is important, and the less subjects we have, the less we have to offer. And that means we deny our young the opportunities. Now, I don't really care what happens down south. I don't care what happens in Ireland and Iceland. I don't care what happens in Netherlands. I care what happens in Scotland. I care what happens in Glasgow. And I know that our young need jobs. I know our young need to be professionals. If we want to attract industry from overseas, we need to have a professional workforce. For that, we need colleges and courses. And to pretend anything else is different, it's useless. I don't think we should be going there. I think it's very important for us to ensure that we actually represent the needs of our community out there. And this idea about, pulling parties down, trying to read people's figures, that's not what it's about. We need to do a job in the sense that we want to provide for our young, for our future. And we can only do that if we actually provide the service. Now, yes, there are challenges in terms of how we deal with those issues. And one or two members here have asked the question from opposition, so what would you do to do this? Well, talk to people. Don't just bring a policy and go through this charade of a debate and then just pass it on. Speak to people. Share ideas. Come up with conclusions and solutions which are actually fit for purpose. We all say that, we have free education in our universities. What about our colleges? If you can't get into a college, then you have to pay for it to get somewhere else. So it's no free then, is it? Free is only free if you get access and you get the opportunity to study. And you're not going to get it if we go down the road we're going down just now.
1 minute left.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We must come up with solutions, but they have to be genuine solutions. We must work with people with an open heart and open mind. Young people, I think, deserve the best that's available. We know that we can provide it. We have a rich history. We don't need to prove to ourselves that we are in a position to do it. We can, and we have done it, and we will do it in the future. But we have to be focused. Let's forget the narrowness of party political broadcasts and actually deliver to the people who need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I apologise to the one member that I've been unable to call. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Neil Findlay with a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Hugh Henry eloquently described the value of Scotland's colleges, and I know that because I benefited greatly from both a vocational and academic education in college. But in light of a whole range of issues that have arisen, I and many other people involved in Scottish education have grave concerns. It's our duty to hold the Government to account for its actions, or indeed lack of them. And across so many areas of the skills, learning and indeed employment agenda, the Government's policies superficially appear to be heading in the right direction. But when exposed to even the most rudimentary scrutiny, they are exposed for the illusion that they are. If we look at the smoke and mirrors we have witnessed with the Modern Apprenticeships programme, or the manipulation of positive outcomes data to include activity agreements, or the decline of the careers service, all of this, we're told by government ministers, and their spin machine is just going splendidly. It's all a huge success, and anyone who dares question any of it is being negative, and that old chestnut talking Scotland down. Well, I say we are standing up for Scotland's young people. We are supporting Scottish education by advocating for those who raise their concerns with us, because they fear raising them with the Government, because if they do, they will get the Russell treatment.
Claire Adamson.
Mr Finlay, you spoke about the figures regarding modern apprenticeships. What message does it send to a young person who's undertaken a young apprenticeship that has somehow stolen a job for someone because they were in that job when they undertook their apprenticeship?
Neil Finlay.
I haven't a clue what you're referring to, but we will come to modern apprenticeships, I'm sure, over the next couple of weeks. But it's in this area of college provision where some of the worst damage is occurring. And let us be clear that this is an area of policy drawn up by, promoted, implemented and defended by the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Culture. It's his agenda that's driving the policy of regionalisation, not with educational improvement at its core, but with cost-cutting as its driving principle. He claims his policy will result in significant financial savings, but provides no evidence whatsoever to back his assertion. He claims, as Liz Smith explained, that there are no waiting lists, yet Scotland's colleges tell us 21,000 are on the list. He says there are no budget cuts, but Audit Scotland and Scotland colleges tell us there are a 24% cut over the spending review period. And what is the Cabinet Secretary's response? They are all wrong. And we heard that today in his speech. But why should we be surprised? Sorry, not at the moment. Do something uncharacteristic and listen for a change. But why should we be surprised? Why should we be surprised? Because he has form on this. Time and again, the Education Committee has had witnesses give evidence before it, with the media providing support and information of 1,400 job losses across the sector in the last year, 30,000 loss of places for women students, 70,000 fewer part-time places for adult learners and others, and an overall cut, as Mr Bibby said, of 34% of places for young people with learning difficulties. Not at the moment, I've got a lot to say. But of course, according to the Cabinet Secretary, they are all wrong. So maybe I could now give him the extended opportunity, or extend the opportunity to him, to apologise to the 30,000 women mentioned by Anne McTaggart, to the hundreds of students with learning difficulties mentioned by Mr Bibby. Happy to give him the opportunity to apologise if he would like to take it.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll take the opportunity to say that I have never said there are no cuts in the system. You therefore misrepresented what I was going to say. There have been cuts. Those cuts that have taken place largely because of financial pressure, started by Labour, continued by Tory and Lib Dems. But we are going to end up with a better sector despite what you're saying.
Neil Finlay.
Didn't quite catch an apology there. And members will recall last year, after an extensive campaign by students, college unions and the Labour Party, that we did see some extra cash allocated to the college budget when the Finance Secretary announced an additional £15 million in the College Transformation Fund.
1 minute left.
And to be fair, this fund has enabled transformation to occur in our colleges, most notably the transformation of 1,400 lecturers and support staff from full-time employees to people on the dole. The Cabinet Secretary, these are career transformations that college employees could well do without. Mary Scanlon mentioned the 24% budget cut. This means fewer lecturers, larger classes, courses cut and closed down, and waiting lists growing. And despite the evidence, the Cabinet Secretary claims there is nothing wrong. Like the Walter Mitty figure he is, he dismisses what is happening in the real world and continues on in his fantasy land, thinking everyone is just going along with him. Now, the Cabinet Secretary could never be described as a modest man lacking in self-admiration. But I was surprised to learn yesterday that rather than welcome the opportunity to spread the word of all the good work he's doing in colleges, he uncharacteristically sought to prevent others from hearing his sparkling oratory. Indeed, so determined to keep his utterances quiet, he exploded in frustration at not having the powers to
Mr.
sack
Finlay, you must come to a
Mr. Ramsay.
conclusion.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, I was just getting to my punchline, but I'll leave him wounded without putting the fatal blow in.
I now call on Angela Constance. A tight 8 minutes. Order, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. At a core level, for me, the purpose of education ultimately is to prepare young people for work. It's to prepare young people to stand on their own 2 feet, to prepare them for adult life where they can provide for themselves and their family, make their own way in the world and, I suppose, ultimately to be independent. And as Mark MacDonald said, it's imperative, in fact, it's crucial that any debate that we have on education should not be a debate in isolation from what's happening in our economy. And indeed, one of the reasons with regards to my own appointment as the first ever Minister for Youth Employment was to ensure a better alignment between the world of education and the world of work, and how we can't look at the supply of skills in education and training in isolation from the demand for those skills. So for 2 years now, I've reported to Michael Russell as a junior minister over 3 portfolios. And I have to say, because this is where experience and facts come into things. I report to Mr Russell as a junior minister, as a woman, and some of the language bandied about here today I do not recognise in that of a colleague that I have worked with and that I have reported for 2 years. And I think it's scurrilous and a slur on his character that members of this Parliament have succumbed to such depths. And of course, to be frank, I give Mr Russell far more cheek on a daily basis than I would ever dare give Mr Swinney. No thanks. No thanks. No thanks. Nope.
Mr Henry, Ms Constance not taking intervention.
I want to stick to the facts and the purpose of this debate, because I was pleased that Liz Smith recognised that we are living with the reality of Tory cuts, and we're living with that reality now. So we are indeed making tough decisions, and we're making those tough decisions now. And we are indeed reforming public services such as colleges, but maintaining our priorities, which is student numbers, the full-time equivalents, not the dodgy Labour Party figures. We are indeed prioritising young people in the context of maintaining student numbers. We do have record levels of student support, second to none anywhere in these islands. We are maintaining the volume of teaching. We do have opportunities for all and have retained benefits such as the educational maintenance allowance. And while there's no denying that there are budget reductions, by the end of our second term of office, we will have invested £5 billion in the college sector. Yet our budget has been slashed by £3.3 billion. Interesting, we will spend 40% more in cash terms in FE than our Labour Liberal predecessors did, despite their budget going up by £10 billion. And the reason I raise that, Presiding Officer,
is that the Labour Party, along with their Liberal colleagues, should have been reforming this crucial sector at a time of comparative plenty, but they choose not to do so. And what did that increased investment achieve over the first decade of devolution? Do we have a first-class, a world-class vocational education system that is highly regarded by young people, trade unions and employers alike? Do we have a world-class vocational education system on a par with Germany, Austria, Norway, Netherlands? Do we have a country like these Northern European countries that have youth unemployment at less than 10%? Because that is exactly what we should be aspiring to, Presiding Officer. And with regards to women, and there have been important points raised with regards to women's participation in education, but the facts are that the majority of students in further education are women, 54% as conceded by Liz Smith herself, and colleges continue and will continue to offer a vast range of flexible training opportunities. And it's this government that has boosted childcare funds by 42% since 2006 and 2007. So I think we can stand firm and proud by our record. And our ambition is, in recognition that those from disadvantaged backgrounds are still underrepresented in further and higher education, and that is exactly what we intend to tackle. And of course, a group of people dear to my heart is adults with learning difficulties, because I started off my social work career working in residential care with adults with learning difficulties some 15, nearly 20 years ago. And I think it's such a pity that Mr Bibby, yes, and Mr Finlay's waving the report around, it's such a pity that they're relying on a report that is 1 year old, a report that predates the introduction of opportunities for all. And let me reiterate what Dennis Robertson said, and let me reiterate my commitment. Opportunities for all is indeed for every young person in this country. No thank you. You've been shouting in my ear all afternoon, and you are not showboating on my time, Mr Finlay. And students with difficulties will be supported on any course that they are admitted to, and colleges are indeed highly skilled in this sort of support, and I, for one, certainly don't believe in segregation. Presiding Officer, we have a good educational offering in this country. It is not perfect, it needs refined and it needs reformed. But we are indeed preparing our young people better than ever before for the world of work. We can look at positive destinations, we can look at the academic achievements of our young people. But what our young people need now is the opportunity to work, Presiding Officer. So this debate should be about the economy and who controls our economy. And this government, over and above our £2.5 billion year-on-year investment in post-16 education and training, we will spend an additional £80 million supporting young people towards and into work. And that will benefit an additional 23,000 young people. And that's before we even get to the 1,700 modern apprentices under the age of 25. That's before we even count the young people currently benefiting from a college education or opportunities for all. But the reality is we need to help tens of thousands of more young people more, and the answer for that lies in our economy. And the choices, and Liz Smith did touch on choices. Well, the choices, no, I'm in my last minute, and the choices that I will happily make and defend is that we should be making the choice to invest additional money in an employer recruitment incentive that's going to get our young people actually into work. And I wonder if the opposition parties will be honest about their choices. How much more money do you want for further education, and from where should we cut?
You must finish.
Perhaps Mr Brown will answer that in his closing. And of course, colleges themselves have choices. They have choices about the reserves that they have, the £200 million reserves that they have.
Minister,
thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Order. Before I call Gavin Brown, I know what Ms Constance said about language at the start of her speech. I intend to have the records checked for unparliamentary language, and I remind all members that in this chamber they should be courteous and respectful. The people they represent expect nothing less. Gavin Brown, a tight 10 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me begin by just looking at the actual budget for Scotland versus the budget for colleges and further education, because we have had many statistics bandied about this afternoon, but I get the clear impression that the very few of those who quoted economic and budget statistics had actually read any budget document. Let me just pick out the cash terms budget for Scottish DEL. In 2011-12, at the start of the spending review period, the entire DEL budget for Scotland was £28.3 billion. For the financial year we're debating at the moment, 2013-14, the entire DEL budget is £28.4 billion. A very, very modest increase in cash terms, a real terms cut, as Liz Smith acknowledged, but a real terms increase in cash over the course of the spending review period. Contrast that, Presiding Officer, with the position for colleges in Scotland. In 2011-12, the year I quoted for Scottish DEL as a whole, the budget for colleges was £570 million. Next year, it will be £511 million, a cut of £60 million in cash terms from the Scottish budget as a whole in cash terms is going up. So perhaps anyone in the SNP benches can explain to me how that shows colleges to be a priority when they get a drastic cut as the budget goes up in cash terms. But let's look at another very worrying statistic that has come up time and again from the opposition in this debate, and it's the 70,000 drop in headcount in just 2 years. That is an alarming statistic that ought to be having every single one of us in this chamber looking deeply at it, not least the government. Angela Constance had the audacity to stand up at the end of her speech and say we need to help tens of thousands more. What about the 70,000 people in Scotland that no longer have access to college? Now, I'll happily give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Beginning of my speech, a number of members made it in the debate, and I do just try and say it seriously. You have to look in college numbers, not at headcount, but at full-time equivalent. Because only if you look at full-time equivalent do you actually get a figure of who is going to college. To fail to do that distorts the figures completely.
Gavin Brown. I don't know if Mike Russell was listening to Mike Russell's speech at the start of the debate today, but to suggest that the only statistic that matters is one which ignores completely 3/4 of the people in our colleges is patently absurd. He nonchalantly wafted away the fact that we had a 70,000 cut in just 2 years as, I quote, a rather volatile statistic. It doesn't matter that it's gone down by 70,000. Well, it does matter, Presiding Officer. It was 374,000 just 2 years ago. Then it has gone down to 305,000. Now, if it's volatile, if it's just a volatile one of these things, as Mike Russell seems to think, is he suggesting that when we get the figures for next year, it will have gone up by 70,000? Or is it more likely that the figure again will have gone down? Presiding Officer, we had a couple of other corkers, I have to say, from the government and the SNP members over the course of the afternoon. I have to say I do feel it is a little churlish to dismiss entirely that which went before. Yes, the college system was not perfect when it was run before. Yes, things ought to change. Yes, we should always strive to be better. But to dismiss it almost in its entirety does a great disservice to the many, many wonderful staff and students across the country. I mean, Mr. Russell said there was division among staff before he came along. Well, the great healer, Presiding Officer, has united parties across this chamber. He has united staff the length and breadth of this country, just not in the way that he thinks he has done. And to describe part-time courses, as Mr Russell did and as Joan McAlpine did, as simply hobby courses, I think does an enormous disservice. And I have to say, if any SNP member wants to stand up and tell the Chamber which hobby courses they think ought to be cut and which colleges they think are running hobby courses, I'll accept that invitation with alacrity, Presiding Officer. And then we heard it's difficult to pick the most absurd comment that was made, but the Minister and Marco Biaggi think the solution to our college crisis is to spend the reserves, Presiding Officer. Don't worry about what may come in the future. Let's just spend those reserves and everything will be absolutely fine. Presiding Officer, the budget that is given to the colleges is extremely important. Now, we heard from the First Minister last week in FMQs trying to wriggle free by comparing the current college budget with the budget of the previous Labour and Liberal Democrat executive. But not their last budget, though, Presiding Officer, their budget from 1999. And he suggested that because the budget they're getting next year is bigger than the budget in 1999, they should be jolly lucky and fortunate with all they have. Well, I had a quick look to see what it was with the last budget put forward by the Labour and Liberal Democrat executive. In 2007-8, current funding for FE colleges was £526 million. In 2014-15, at the end of the spending review, the current funding for FE colleges will be £470 million. That is a pretty big reduction from 2007-8. We've heard time and again repeated, and it's worth repeating again, the real terms position in relation to colleges. There is a real terms cut, Presiding Officer, to the Scottish DEL budget over the spending review period. We have said this in this chamber before. Liz Smith said it again today. It is, in fact, a 6% real terms cut to the Scottish DEL budget over the course of the spending review period. But the real terms cut to colleges between 11-12 and 14-15 isn't 6%. It's not 10%, it's not 12%, it's 24% over that same period. So I repeat again, if colleges are genuinely a priority for this government, how on earth can you have a 24% real terms cut for them when there is a 6% real terms cut for the budget as a whole? Now, it's not just opposition parties who are worried about what is happening to colleges. We've heard a number of quotes from government members over the course of the afternoon. But it's interesting because the only quotes they could produce were quotes that supported in principle the idea of mergers, regionalisation and change. What they have been unable to quote is a single source who thinks that the college budget put forward for next year is a good idea. Those two things are not the same, Presiding Officer. Let me quote Jeremy Peat, who gave evidence to the Finance Committee on the 3rd of October. He said this: I like the structural changes that are going through, and I believe that substantial efficiency gains can come from them. But, as I said earlier, I worry about whether the resource will be available for the skills development end of FE on a lifetime learning basis. You should ensure, he was addressing the Finance Committee, you should ensure that that is addressed as a priority, because it is important. We heard from Professor Jim Gallagher, who said that it would be very difficult to maintain quality provision under the current circumstances. And Audit Scotland, again, when they looked at it in greater depth, said, as Mary Scanlon pointed out very, very carefully, the Scottish Government should provide a clear assessment of the expected benefits and costs of regionalisation and how the benefits will contribute to reform objectives and how the costs are to be funded. We hadn't had that before, Presiding Officer. We still haven't had it yet from the Scottish Government. But one of the consequences of the savage cuts to the college budgets that we've heard about was exactly as Elizabeth Smith put in her motion. If you have drastic cuts, you will narrow access instead of widening access. And I've touched on already the decrease in the total number of headcount over the course of 2 years. But, as Elizabeth Smith pointed out, there was a 26% decline in female numbers since 2007, compared to a 13% decline in male numbers. That, again, is another statistic that should deeply worry all of us. But again, it was nonchalantly dismissed by by the Cabinet Secretary and others. I will close. I'm in my final minute, so I'm afraid I'm unable to do so. But let me close with a quote from John Henderson, which Elizabeth Miss touched on as well. One of the enormous strengths of the college system is its ability to cater for a diverse range of students at different times in their lives. Any narrowing of that risks limiting the opportunities available. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government have to think again about their draft budget. They have to take seriously the concerns that have been put forward today, and I'm very, very happy to conclude this debate and support Elizabeth Smith's motion. Thank you.
That does conclude the debate on education. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 4797 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the Request to Speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 4797. Minister.
Formally moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 4797 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion numbers 4798 and 4799 on approval of SSIs. The question on these motions will be put at decision time. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4787.2 in the name of Michael Russell, which seeks to amend motion number 4787 in the name of Liz Smith on education be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4787.2 in the name of Michael Russell is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 53. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4787.1 in the name of Hugh Henry, which seeks to amend motion number 4787 in the name of Liz Smith on education be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the amendment 4787.1 in the name of Hugh Henry is as follows. Yes, 53. No, 65. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4787 in the name of Liz Smith as amended on education be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 4787 in the name of Liz Smith as amended is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 53. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4798 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4799 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.